Welcome. There's a little box if you're calling in on a computer, and just a little housekeeping chat box. If someone can just say something that you can see us okay, so we know we're broadcasting, that would be awesome. Raise your hand in the Q&A, or you can just say something in the chat box. All right, good. Peter, thank you for that. So welcome, everybody. This is the second time we're going to be talking about Medcura. And the reason is there's a significant amount of updates, plus we had a bunch of people that couldn't make it, even though we're going to record this once again and post it on the Family Office Insights website. John Harrington, our dear friend, is on the call. And I'm just going to have a shout out to Peter because he's just a great human being and a great friend. And so he can't reply to that. So that's why I said it. We would normally be in Peter's conference room in Midtown in New York City, doing this sort of thing. And we miss him and his hospitality dearly. But Peter, thanks for coming on. John Harrington, who I just mentioned, is responsible for our connectivity for the Family Office Insights in the community to Medcura. Even though the technology is way over my skis, I've learned a lot in listening to Larry about what's going on here, and have the joy and opportunity to not only see this presentation but talk about this in detail. So again, do a little housekeeping. If you want to raise your hand and ask a question, please do. If you want to put it in the chat box, please do. I'm going to hand it off to Larry now, and we'll commence the formal presentation. And please feel free to be as intimate as you want with us. So there you go, Larry. Thank you.
Sounds good, Art. And thanks for everybody for joining. As Art mentioned, had a fair bit of interest after last week's, and also a lot has gone on even since we last talked, and have sent out a couple of updates to the FOI kind of family about moving into our brand new facility, and also about some of the work that's being done for our military program. And so we're going to share those with you today. But Medcura is an advanced materials company, and so what we do is we make some really interesting materials that do two things really, really well. They, on one hand, they create these really great biological seals. So they sit down onto an open wound or a surgical incision site, and they create they're adhesive, and they create a seal so that it keeps your blood where you want it to be. But they also create a barrier on the other side. So that's the other really important part. And what that means is that while your coagulative proteins are concentrating to create a nice clot underneath our materials, on top, our materials are creating a barrier for bugs and dirt and other things to get into your wound and infect it or create disease. And obviously what we're all experiencing now is just an example of what happens when external pathogens invade your body. So as I mentioned last week, and Art was kind enough to highlight in the materials that went out today, some incentives around our current financing. So we're raising $5.5 million. $500,000 of that is convertible debt from a recent financing that will convert into this round. So we're raising $5 million of new money. We've been very fortunate. Recently, we've gotten a series of new commitments, and in fact, even since we did our presentation last week, we've gotten some new commitments to the round, mostly from healthcare providers. We've had a couple of new luminary surgeons join our investment group, as well as a family office associated with Morgan Stanley. And in some respects, driven by a program that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on today, where it's an investor incentive where investors in this round can get half of their investment back in cash. And we'll spend some time explaining how that works. There is no risk to being part of that program, and there's a real opportunity to significantly reduce the cost per share in this transaction. So we're in a pretty simple business. We're in a business of necessity. There's no clinical procedure. I would argue in almost all of our lives, there's no situation where actively bleeding is an outcome that any of us want to last any longer than necessary. And because of the way our technology works and because of our capabilities, we're able to develop products that stem anywhere from simple first aid all the way to military and traumatic injuries. And in fact, I'm going to share a little bit of an update with you guys, today on our military program. Our products have been clinically proven. So we're going to show you some data as we go through this today about how well a bandage that we make can stop bleeding after a routine clinical procedure, and that can dramatically reduce the time it takes for a patient to get clotted, ambulated, and discharged, providing a real economic advantage to the clinician and benefit to the patient as well. And then finally, our products are partnered. So we already have a first commercial partnership in place. We're working hard with that group right now and actually have seen increased interest in our products because they are so protective. And so I'm going to show you actually what that product looks like and some of our plans around moving into the first aid market, first here in North America and then worldwide. So let me show you how our product works in action. So what you see here to the left are a series of materials that are commonly used to manage bleeding. Biopolymers are used in a number of advanced applications. Cellulose is what's used in every J&J product. And fibrin is actually a protein that your body makes that is now used in combination that dominates the surgical landscape. So what we're doing is we're mixing highly heparinized or anticoagulated human blood. And what you see on the left is as we mix this really thin blood with these materials, they start to get thicker and create a really good environment eventually for clotting to occur. But what you see on the right is the immediate and almost instantaneous action of our material creating a seal in that test tube and then holding the weight of the rest of the blood that's on the other side of that seal on vial inversion. So this gives you a pretty good example of how our product works in terms of performance, but indeed this is in a somewhat artificial situation because none of us bleeds, in a test tube or in a little jar. So this is more similar to what we do routinely. This is routine pig surgery. What you see here is a model that the FDA likes to use for submissions for prior to doing human clinical trials. And what you saw there is Dr. Felix Vega actually putting our lead surgical product, which is a clear and transparent gel, onto a pretty significant wound. And so there's a couple things to kind of make note of. One is the material is transparent. You can actually see through it and see underneath it. The reason it's a little darker, darker red or almost brown, is because that's the pig's fibrin and fibrinogen and thrombin coming together to create a clot. What also is interesting is this, like most wounds, are three-dimensional. So before we put our material on, this was bleeding from the bottom, from the sides, and even from the top. And what you saw there, and in just 2 minutes, we were able to completely stop bleeding in that surgical incision on all those different parameters. Finally, what you don't see here is at the end, what our material does is it just degrades and is passed out through a patient's liver and kidneys. So very safe, very supple, and very useful surgical product. And that's important because I am going to show you how important the surgical market is for us. Now let's look. We've seen our product work on the benchtop. We've seen it work in a surgical situation, but we've also done this on human beings in the clinic. So when you go to have a stent put in or a routine diagnostic procedure for cardiology, you are the physician will use your arteries as kind of a highway to your heart. So they put some inducers and catheters in there, they put a wire up into your heart, and then they start to do some work on you. At the end of those procedures, two things are important. One, just like the material we put in that first benchtop video, you're highly heparinized because they don't want you to have a big clot occur during the procedure. If a clot occurs, you might have a stroke or you might have a heart attack. That's the exact opposite of what a clinician wants to do. So at the end of these procedures, a plastic wristband is slipped around your wrist after all the gear is pulled out, and you have a pretty good hole in your artery, and again, you're highly anticoagulated. So it takes a clinician now about 2 hours to safely stop your bleeding. So we worked with the University of Chicago on this first study, and in the first 50 patients that we used our product, our mean time or our average time to stopping that bleeding was 40 minutes. So we dramatically reduced the time it takes to stop bleeding. But maybe as interesting is we also had really great outcomes. So we had, in all these 50 patients, none of them had another re-bleeding event that required them to be readmitted to the hospital. We also had no occlusion, so we had no situations where we had somebody's artery kind of close up on us, which is problematic because then you don't get good blood flow to the hand and to the arm. We had no cutaneous discomfort, meaning we had no rashes or any inflammation that the patient noticed on the access site. And then finally, and really important, if this is one of our loved ones, we had no significant bruising. So what you will unfortunately see in some of these circumstances when you put the wristband on is when you squeeze down as hard as you do, you push the blood up underneath the skin, up the arm, and you get a really bad bruise. So now, although that's really interesting from the perspective of the doctors and the patients, there is a real economic impact on the hospital and on the clinic. By reducing the time it takes to get these patients to hemostasis, you can do more procedures a day. If you can do more procedures a day on a fixed cost, you can increase revenues and you can increase bottom line profit. But maybe as exciting is, again, being somebody who, many of us who are over 45 years old are going to have one of these procedures in the next 15 to 20 years, is that the outcomes were better. So from the patient's perspective, I'm in and out faster, I'm home quicker, and I'm not having any other rebleeding or some of these other events that otherwise are problematic now in about 10% of the cases. We also believe that that means more satisfied patients. More satisfied patients means better healthcare grades. Better healthcare grades means driving greater awareness and interest in using that clinic. So that really is a kind of a clear showing of the use of our material moving all the way to and being really impactful in the clinic. So, but we're building a business here. And the way we think about our business is we've built it and we were going to layer on top one revenue stream after another. And we're starting with external or topical hemostasis because our early interactions and engagements with the FDA allowed us to get a series of clearances that could build the beginning of that foundation. And indeed, we did that. So we have 4 separate approvals from the FDA associated with first aid, another approval for the product I just showed you that we used at the University of Chicago. But we've always known that we want to move from this external or topical hemostasis to eventually moving to internal use of our product. And the reason for that's really important. And I'm going to show you an example of that here in just one second. But it's important for a couple of reasons. The biggest reason is, from a business perspective, is these internal applications are very big and very lucrative markets. But where we started was being able to create a foundation. And that foundation was around the local management of routine bleeding across a broad spectrum of wounds, and including antibacterial claims and the ability to provide our products, our over-the-counter products, our consumer products, in a non-sterile preparation. That means the FDA has seen that our materials are so inert, they're so safe, that we don't even need to sterilize them before putting them in the market. And then we layered on top of that and got our clearance for our vascular closure product, which again, we just showed you the work from the University of Chicago. So I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar at the moment here and now show you the other end of the spectrum. So we've talked before about traumatic wounds. And so, Art, I don't know, can you see, I just changed my screen to something that says life foam controls bleeding from non-compressible abdominal wounds. Is that?
Yes.
Fantastic. So this is this data really, we just shared this data with the U.S. military. So the U.S. military gave us a grant of about just under $1.5 million to make a product like this. So unfortunately, some of our warriors are injured in battle, shot, as you see the example here, and they start to bleed internally. Bleeding internally is the single largest cause of death in combat. And so they asked us to work on a program with them where we would make an expandable foam that you could literally inject into the abdomen of a patient. And as you see here in this third window pane, that material will expand and stop bleeding long enough to get that warrior back to a field hospital so that you can suction out, remove the materials, and be able to treat that patient and maintain their life. So we started working very hard on this, and this is an example of the current prototype of the injectable gun that we use. And what you see there are two large canisters. One's filled with one material, one's filled with the other. When you combine the two together, it creates this flowable material. And so a couple cool things about this program. One, it's seen as so really disruptive that the FDA has designated it as a breakthrough device. But they didn't know what we now know, which is that when we actually use this, what you can see here is our ability to dramatically change the outcome for these patients. So we've worked through a series of different formulations, and we've now gotten to one we really like. This formulation has kept all of the patients alive for over 3 hours. And that is a significant difference because you can see here, initially these patients start off with about 80 millimeters of mercury for their blood pressure. After the injury, they plummet because they're bleeding so profusely internally, right to the point where they get down to about 15 millimeters of mercury. For a human being, this is when you call the priest, not when you call a doctor. But in this model, by putting our materials in rapidly, we can then bring that blood pressure back up, getting them almost back to where they started, and then maintaining their life and allowing them to be treated. So that's just one example of what our products can do. So I'm going to jump now back into the slides and then and show you now how we're building our business. So as I said, for us, we believe in building a foundation with the FDA, building a manufacturing foundation, building a commercial foundation, and a foundation of revenue. So we're starting that in first aid or over-the-counter products. And we're very fortunate that we've been able to recruit and sign the largest provider of distributor and manufacturer of first aid products in North America. So the group we're working with, which is ASO Medical of Sarasota, Florida, ASO makes and sells 4 billion Band-Aids a year into roughly the $1 billion North American market. We're working with ASO to bring a first product on the shelf in early 2021. We've got multiple different SKUs or product confirmations for not just the retail first aid market, but also for the industrial first aid market for first aid kits and providing materials to companies like Cintas, who sell things to, restaurants and even hospitals and the like. Our partner is giving us non-dilutive support to scale up our manufacturing. And what's really important about this relationship is they already have active contracts and they have active sales with a very broad cross-section of potential channel partners. So they're selling products to CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, Walmart, Target, Dollar General, Dollar Tree, Kroger's, and the like. And we're leveraging that sales and marketing infrastructure. So this is a mock-up of what our first product looks like. It's going to be a bleed block. We're still working on the kind of the trademarking, but we're going to provide a wound gel to the market that not only will be the first advanced hemostat of the market that is provided in a thick kind of gel format, we also are providing the first one that is combined to have antibacterial claims on the label. And that's really important because our partner has been looking for a product like this for years, because their market research and the market research of their partners shows that there's a real great need for this. But this is really just the beginning for us. So what we want to do next is not only expand the sales of this product to a much broader set of channel partners, we also want to move from a wound gel based product to coating Band-Aids. And you can certainly imagine that if we can just convert a percentage of the 4 billion Band-Aids a year that ASO currently sells, even at a penny or a portion of a penny a piece, that's a pretty significant potential revenue stream. So for us, the over-the-counter market provides us with a really great opportunity to build capacity, build revenues, build commercial traction, while also preparing ourselves for these more lucrative markets. So, as I mentioned, trauma and military are one, but the other one that you have to look at is surgical. The reason for that is the surgical hemostatic market in the United States is actually larger than the first aid market. And indeed, it's really concentrated. So we're going after the most lucrative part of that market, which is the flowable market. So the reason we're doing that is the product we're using for the military is flowable, and we actually use some of the money that the military gave us to make a series of formulations that also can be used for civilian surgery. And so we're focused on this part of the market because this is where the margins are. So we've done an awful lot of market research. We've just finished a study run by some ex-Baxter Biosurgery and J&J executives. Indeed, these two guys just led the most recent surgical hemostatic product that was brought into the U.S. market. And they told us going into this work that we really needed to be able to get a scoring for a willingness to trial of 6 or higher for either Baxter, J&J, or any of the other bigger medical device companies to consider this as a potential M&A target. What you see here is that our scores were closer to 8 than they were to 6. So really great to see that the surgeons and the thought-leading surgeons that we used for this study were so interested in both a gel and a foam version of our product, although obviously they were rated gel a little higher, and that's why we're starting there. So we took that learning and we created a product profile. We built to that product profile, and we've now tested this product profile in a series of porcine studies, in a series of 13-week and 6-week survival studies and implantation studies. And the gel, a very similar version of the gel formulation that we use in surgery is the one that we're bringing to market for our consumer product. So the FDA has actually already seen that product and seen us go through systemic tox, cytotox, and sensitization studies that are required for the FDA clearances we already have. So it's a great base for us. But the cool thing about this product is it works a lot better because the chemical formulation is slightly different than our over-the-counter product. So this is a much more significant surgical wound. This is called the liver cruciate injury. It is one that you use to really stress your product. And not only did we do this injury, but we did it on a pig that has been given a significant amount of anticoagulant or heparin. So this makes this a really hard bleed to stop. But what you're about to see here with just application of this material for 3 minutes that same gel that I showed you before has now created complete hemostasis. But indeed, not just have we created hemostasis, but we've created it with a very, very useful material, because all of these injuries eventually need to be closed. And they're not just left to be closed by materials like ours. They eventually, in most cases, require some surgical sewing. And what you see there is the ability to sew right through our material without any disturbance of that clot. So kind of back to the business case. If you look at how the market is currently serviced, you have kind of two separate product categories. One product category are mechanical hemostats. So these are sponges and powders and sutures and clamps. They work okay. They're very mechanical in what they do, but they're inexpensive. So and they don't have a lot of prep time. They're very simple products. But what's happened over the last 15 years is that the time in the OR is so valuable. More expensive products have come to the OR that are flowable. Why? Because they work better, they're easier to put into small spaces, and they create a greater hemostatic environment than the mechanical products do. But the downside of these products is they require human proteins to work well. And so that means the cost of them is much higher. We already know that we can stop the same to mild and moderate bleeds. You saw how quickly we can clot those injuries. There's no swelling when you put our material in. So we know we can compete head-to-head, if not improve the performance relative to the standard of care in stopping bleeding. We also know that our materials can be easily, because they're flowable, we can push them down a trocar and use them for minimally invasive surgery, laparoscopic or endoscopic surgery. But what's really interesting when we talked to the surgeons was there's no prep time. Our products are rip and go. If you decide you need it, you take the package, you rip it open, you pull out the syringe, and you start using it. The current standard of care requires, in some case, removal from the freezer and time to thaw. In other cases, it requires you taking that material and mixing it at the table. All of that means that I, as a surgeon, have to anticipate what's about to happen and get materials that are ready to go ahead of the time. But it isn't just about providing a better tool to the surgeon, it's about providing greater value to the hospital. We can, so right now, products like FlowSeal, TisSeal, SurgiFlow are generally provided in a 5 to 7 mil unit. We're planning to provide twice the unit volume for about half the price. So we not only dramatically reduce the amount of cost in the surgery, but we can do that at a high profit margin, roughly 88 to 90% margins. And the same guys that did the market research for us did their own independent sales forecast, where they showed peak revenues of our first product, being the clear gel product I showed you, again, having peak revenues around $185 million. So significant top line opportunity, but with a significant bottom line effect. So that really kind of describes the high level of our business. I'll just jump up here and okay, looks like we're good on Q&A. So now let's talk a bit more about the financing. So one of the things that I went over kind of very quickly last time that both Art and John suggested I spend a little more time on is how are we doing this, and then how does this benefit the investor? So we're pushing hard on a first closing of our Series A financing through some convertible notes. The reason we use these notes is the notes allow an investor to take advantage of two really important things. One, They lock in the price and they lock in the terms of the eventual equity investment. So these notes will convert into Series A equity at a fixed price, at a fixed set of terms, and all of the notes will convert into the same type of equity. But secondly, it provides the investors access to this really awesome program. So investments up to $500,000 using the schema that I just showed you allow the investor to receive 50% or half of their money back in cash. The company is going to support applications to this program for those who are investing in this note. And really what's important is now let me kind of show you the schematic of how this works. A little bit of a success in the past. So we've returned over $3 million in funds back to our investors using this program. And indeed, our most recent financing, 80% of the investors who were applicants to this program actually received the 50% benefit back on their investment. So pretty simple. You make an investment in the note here in the next week or so. The company will work with you to submit your application to the Department of Commerce of the state of Maryland early in June. You'll then receive a password and a username. On July 1st, you'll jump on a website. You'll plug in those things, you'll push a button, and you'll get into an electronic queue. The state of Maryland then will work through the queue and will start sending out award letters. When you receive your award letter, we will then work with you to convert your note into Series A preferred equity, again, at a fixed price on a fixed set of terms. We will handle all the paperwork for you. We will then submit your final package to the state of Maryland that shows that you indeed have now bought equity in the company and that you bought equity at a certain level. Again, if I used the example before, if you make a $500,000 investment, you would then be getting a credit for $250,000. Whether you're a Maryland resident, an Alaskan resident, you can live in Canada, you can live in Tasmania. As long as you're a taxpayer or you invest through some kind of tax-paying entity, all you then do is the first quarter of the year after you get your tax credit, you'll file a tax return with the state of Maryland. For most of our investors, they will put zeros all the way through because they have no tax liability. And then their tax credit, which will be, again, an example I gave, $250,000, becomes your refund. And literally, the comptroller of Maryland will write you a check for the size of your tax credit. So you put in $500,000, you get a $250,000 tax credit. That turns into a $250,000 refund, which is sent directly to your home. We know this works, and so we're so confident in this, we've actually built in the election to move from debt into equity in the hands of the investor. Because once the investor gets this letter, they're going to want to make this conversion and buy Series A shares with the principal that's in the note. So again, we've done this before, and the reason we go through this process is just because this is the requirement in order for the tax credit to work for our investors.
Larry, can you go back to the prior slide? So
yes.
I learned this, and I think and I could be wrong, but my question to Larry was, okay, why did 80% of the investors get their money back, and where can this go off the rails? And the first thing is I think is when you become qualified, if they run out of the $12 million, you won't get your tax credit award. And so there's one reason why you would not get it. But once you get your tax credit award, you're sure to get it. You just have to follow the next steps and file. And historically, the reason why people didn't get it, the 20%, is not because they didn't get into the queue, it's just they didn't file.
Right. They filed or they filed too late. Art's very correct. If you're going to go through this program, there's just one thing you need to do, and you need to set aside about 15 minutes in your life on July 1st of this year, where you make sure you got a good, strong cup of coffee. You exercise your fingers a little bit. But if you get on when the website opens right at 9 o'clock, type in your username, type in your password, there's a button that says, "Are you a robot?" You hit that button. If you do that, the likelihood of you getting an award is extremely high. The ones who didn't do, we actually had a few folks who invested in the round. They sent in their applications, and then they just blew off the second part of it, the important part of it. We also had a few investors, as I mentioned, Art, who were not qualified because we have one, the University of Maryland made an investment in the last round, and they're not a tax-paying entity. As large as their endowment is and as much money as they make, they're a non-for-profit. But fundamentally, all of our other investors receive the benefit. But thanks for that reminder, Art. So let me just jump down. So let's now talk a little bit about use of funds, and then understand what the exits look like and what the return profile looks like. So we've done a really, I think, an amazing job. I mean, so far we have been able to get multiple products FDA cleared. We've been able to put CGMP manufacturing in place, sign our first commercial partnership, have clear visibility to first revenues, and start a set of internal programs, basically on a combination of about $5 million in equity financing, and then about another $4 million in non-dilutive financing. And indeed, we're still working through some of that non-dilutive financing with the Department of Defense. And as I showed you before, and as I think I sent out to many of you this week, the folks at Fort Detrick have highly recommended, and we're starting to write proposals for grant applications for up to about another $10 million that we should hear about later this year. But this round of financing, this $5.5 million, allows us to do three important things. Allows us to get into the consumer products market. It allows us to expand into at least manufacturing adhesive bandages with our partner. It allows us to partner our vascular closure product, the one we use at the University of Chicago. And then it also allows us to do all the work we need to for our what's called an IDE filing for our first surgical gel, the one I showed you. So that's all the preclinical work that allows the US FDA to say, yep, you guys have shown us that you're safe and effective enough that we're going to let you go into human beings. And then, depending on circumstances, we're going to need to raise about another $10 million, a little bit less than that, to support a human clinical trial for that surgical product. And I'm going to show you in a minute why that's so important, especially layered on top of these other revenue streams. Certainly, and John Harrington talks about this all the time, there are other ways that we may be able to capitalize those clinical trials. We may get a upfront payment for our vascular closure product, which would either reduce or obviate the need for a Series B. Some of the grants that we're applying for at NIH and at the Department of Defense could help support the clinical trial for the surgical product, especially for neurological conditions. And so it's possible that that amount is, either, again, far less or not even necessary. But we want to provide you with a very conservative view of if those things don't happen, we can get this company to cash flow positive on roughly about $15 million in total investment. So how does that kind of fit? So we ended the year with about $2.3 million in cash. Again, there's about $500,000 of convertible debt that will come into this round. But you can see here, we've got about 19 million shares outstanding. You can see our kind of financing history, and you can kind of look at the the offering size and again, the kind of what we need to from today to get to break even. But on the other side, you really have to look at what the return is. And so I want to show you a series of comps that relate to not only our current evaluation, but what we see in the future. So last year, we had revenues actually more than a publicly traded company called Arch Therapeutics. They're also they're pre-revenue. I don't think they had any sales. They had about a $41 million market cap. If you now look at 2021, where we think we're going to do about $1 million in revenues, we look a lot like a company called Closure. And in fact, one of our board members was the chief operating officer at Closure. They had a market cap of about $160 million when they only had $1.5 million in sales. And they were eventually sold to Ethicon for almost $400 million. If you then look at our expected growth when our consumer products business starts to grow and we start to sell some Band-Aids and we start to sell some of our vascular closure products, we look a lot like a company called Metaphor, which had a single surgical product that was sold to C.R. Bard for about $300 million. And then if you move to the point where we actually now add surgical sales to our top line, we become cash flow positive, and we look a lot like a company called Omrix that was sold to J&J for about $500 million. And what's really interesting is these comps, I mean, these have occurred over time, but even more recently, about 18 months ago, Baxter bought two surgical products, Prevaleak and Recothrom, from Mallinckrodt. They paid 10 times annual sales. So about $18 million in sales. They paid $184 million for that product. And they just did it again last year with a product called Seprafilm, another implantable, surgically used material. Again, they paid about 10x. So if you now are looking at our company in kind of 2023 and you see the same, kind of uplift that both Ethicon paid for Omrix and the Baxter's played, you're looking at a $400-500 million company, but one that has an even broader capability when it comes to the development of new products. So none of these companies actually had a core technology platform. They just had products. We're probably only going to make 3 or 4 products by using this platform. Somebody is going to buy this and they're going to make things for nosebleeds, for maybe feminine hygiene, for traumatic injury, for other military applications, and even broader surgical uses like a foam product as well as a gel product. But you can't do any of this without a great team. And I think it really is a testament to who we are and the opportunity these professionals see in our technology. We have handpicked people who have seen this movie before. Rich Vincent was the CFO of the year for San Diego Life Science Startups a couple of years ago. Rich has been my CFO now for a couple of different startup companies. Bruce Choi actually set up manufacturing for Saffion. He's a former Medtronic guy, and Saffion was purchased by Covidien. Elsa, who helps us with the regulatory, Elsa has taken a surgical implantable product through the FDA before. And as I mentioned, we layer on top of that our board members, Jim Buck, COO of Closure, Alex Arrow, former Lazard banker, MD, PhD, has been a C-level executive in a number of vascular closure companies. And then Ed Coulty is a guy who helped us put together our relationship with Aso Medical. Ed was former chairman and CEO of Derma Sciences, took it from sub $5 million a year in revenue. Eventually, the company was sold to Integra for, I think, around $300 million. And then we brought subject matter experts in. Felix Vega, you saw Felix's fingers in those early movies. Felix developed FlowSeal, which is the single largest selling surgical hemostat in the world, while he was at Fusion Medical, and then he went to run development and late stage commercialization for Baxter Biosurgery. And then, of course, you have to have a series of really well-renowned surgeons. Grant Bakikio, Myron Ryan, and David King have all developed surgical and other hemostatic products before. And Joel Buzzy is our emergency room guy. Joel is the medical director of the Winter X Games. And so collectively, our team is really well suited to be able to do this. Obviously, in addition to Matt Dowling, who's the technical founder and CSO, and myself, who you can see my CV online. I'm a career serial entrepreneur and early life sciences commercial guy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Art and to any of you who have questions about our business or about our plans for moving forward.
So thanks, Larry. Peter Thurlow has posed a couple questions here. Let's get to a few of them.
Great.
Hey, he's asking whether you're involved with DARPA.
We have talked to DARPA as well. It's what we've done is focus. It's just timing. The interest in funding internal non-compressible hemorrhage and now it looks like external traumatic hemorrhage have come more from CDRMP a little bit than DARPA, but we are looking at a couple of DARPA grant opportunities right now.
Anybody else is welcome to join in. We've got a couple more questions from Peter. He mentions that the University of Chicago asks if they have an equity interest in what you're doing and that they've recently posted some jobs about tech transfer and have a well thought of innovative group there.
They're a great group. It's interesting. The PI there actually asked us not to seek equity funding from the University of Chicago, and we also did not provide. Dr. Nathan owns no stock in the company. The reason for both of those is that then he has truly no conflicts of interest in this. He is, his initial engagement with the company was purely on the basis of an interested clinician. So we honored his wishes and didn't work with University of Chicago, even though there was some interest. So the University of Chicago they're not in our cap table, nor is Dr. Sandeep Nathan.
Good call, Peter. And then finally, can you talk a little bit about the IP?
Absolutely. Yeah, Peter. So the one thing that Art and I talked about a little bit at the beginning is, so I'm unlike you, although I am a registered patent attorney, I just kind of play one on TV. So we work with some guys. They're now at Morgan Lewis, but we're at Cooley. Dr. Mark Heyman and his team, they've been my patent attorneys for years. You're lucky, Peter. I'm a really pain in the butt client. But we've got a great IP team. 7 issued U.S. patents, 1 granted EU patent. By the way, all of our issued patents you can download them right from our website, as well as all of our peer-reviewed publications are on our website. We have numerous trademarks. But what's really interesting, and this is a little bit geeky, but I think Peter will appreciate this. When you look at our patents, what you see is kind of an operational envelope. And what I mean by that is when you look at the specs and even some of the claims, they talk about hydrophobe length and they talk about grafting density and they talk about concentration and a couple other parameters. And when I first met the team here, I was like, wow, that kind of looks, that seems restrictive. And the answer they gave us is, well, Larry, here's how reality works. When you get outside that envelope, the hydrophobic modification of polysaccharides doesn't work. And indeed, there are peer-reviewed publications of people working outside the envelope and actually kind of teaching away from this application because they didn't optimize the chemistry like we have. And so underneath all the IP and underneath that, there is a lot of in-process formulation and know-how. the kind of the example I showed you for the military program, where we iterated through a number of different formulations to now get one that works extremely well. That's because we can manipulate the hydrophobe length, the fatty acid length on the back. We can actually vary the grafts. We can put them on the backbone in different ways. And then we actually can manipulate concentration and even the formulation of the material of the final product, whether it's in a powder, gel, putty, bandage, or coated bandage application. So there's a lot of depth to what we do, in addition to the stuff works really, really well.
Great. Thank you. All right, so we're coming up against the timeline here. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? And if not, that's cool. We're going to post this also a recording on the Family Office Insights website. Larry, you want to close up with a comment or two?
Yeah, all I would say is...
We have a question here.
Oh, sounds great.
For over-the-counter products, does the material need to be removed after bleeding stops, or does it form a scaffold?
That's a great question. So you can remove our external materials with just some warm water. What happens is that as our material sits down over the bleed and stops and creates that clot, indeed a little bit of our material gets integrated in the clot, but because it's not cross-linked, it's not bound to the rest of the matrix. So when you wash away the rest of the matrix, all you have left underneath it is just the clot. So, and that's true whether it's for an internal application or an external application.
Great. We have another question from another Arthur. For each on the team slide, can we receive a list of how much equity it has, and for the employees, their scheduled cash comp for 2020?
Art, it's good to hear you, and it's good. So Art's one of our investors, and he likes to pick on me a little bit, but certainly happy to share the cap table. And Art, although I'm cash comp for everybody in 2020, I think is a little less important. As what I would say is as I told you when we did the first deal with you a couple of years ago, we're being paid the same amount, the same under market amount as we were a couple of years ago. So that may be a little bit tongue in cheek. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Larry. Okay. Anybody else before we wrap things up? And if not, super grateful for everybody's participation on a Friday afternoon here. We're always happy to have you. I thought Larry's presentation the first go round was extraordinary, and this one was as good, if not better. And I made it a point, as John did, to make sure we covered the detail with regard to the tax credit, because it's seemingly too good to be true, but it works. So you can't argue with that. Obviously, you have to have confidence that the company's going to do well, but independent of that, if you're voting with your checkbook, there's no reason to not vote that way. So anything else, Larry?
No, thank you so much for the last weekend, this week. I guess what I'd say, and it's something that both John Harrington and I believe a lot in, is this is going to be a really successful company, but we're also going to save some lives. And what we've seen in every aspect of using our materials is we can rapidly, safely, and cost-effectively stop bleeding. We can provide antibacterial barriers. And so this kind of material is really what's required to be disruptive in this space. And I think what we're all living through now, and thinking about the future, the need for these kind of protective materials is only going to increase. It's not going to decrease. So opportunity here to be in on the ground floor. And as Art said, the program, it is a little bit hard to believe, but I'll tell you, I put money into the company. I've benefited from it. Many others have, and we know it works, and we know how to do it. We've gotten much smarter about it over the years. So with that, thank all of you, and if you're interested, please reach out.
Great. Thank you, Larry.
Thanks,
you,
guys.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.